Reading 9 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2. Birdlip, March 4th, 1944. The Enneagram 5. As we have seen, mechanical man is given and made to receive the first shock at point 3. This enables him to live a physical existence, but he does not give himself the shock at point 6 or the shock at point 9. We speak again of the triangle within the Enneagram. When he begins to study the nature of the shock at point 6 and try to give himself this shock, he makes a step in the direction of consciousness and inner evolution. One reason why things go as they do in the world is that man is not properly conscious, but assumes that he is. As was said previously, from one side, the object of this work is to increase consciousness. First, one must become more conscious of oneself. Paradoxically, one has to become conscious of the fact that one is not conscious. By direct self-study, one has to realize that one passes most of one's existence in a state of sleep. However, in this state, the shock at point 3 is given and received regularly. If our breathing depended on our conscious attention, we would not remain alive very long. From one angle, then, the study of the shock at point 6 is the study of how to increase consciousness. It is called by the general term self-remembering, but, as was said, the whole application of the work comes in at this point also. The work must be brought up to the place of incoming impressions. This cannot be done unless one is in an unusual state of consciousness, one that is different from one's ordinary state. Between the second state of consciousness and the third, there are many degrees. Let us look at the diagram of the 4 states of consciousness. We can mark degrees between the so-called waking state and the state of self-remembering. Suppose you have an aim, such as not to be negative with a certain person. You will have to keep awake to your aim and to the inner state of yourself at every moment. This will be a kind of self-remembering. When one is remembering oneself, one should remember one's aims. The trouble is that we cannot live for long in this state of increased consciousness because we exhaust the available energy for it. Consciousness, like everything else, is weighed and measured. There is only so much consciousness. After a time, we increase consciousness gradually, and then, instead of falling very deeply asleep after a period of trying to be more conscious, as so often happens, we retain a certain awareness or memory of ourselves, some continuity in our inner life. But our desire for sleep is very great, so that the attempt to give ourselves the shock at point 6 often exhausts us for the time being. We feel we have done enough. Now, sleep is easy because the work is not necessary for life. If you knew that if you stopped remembering yourself for a minute you would die, then it would indeed be difficult to fall asleep. But fortunately, or unfortunately, a person can begin to identify from the moment he gets up in the morning, even through his inner talking, and remain fast asleep all day. When you catch yourself asleep in this way and realize that you have been completely identified with inner talking and making accounts against others and so on, you are in a position to understand what giving oneself the shock at point 6 consists in. I mean that you will be able to see the difference between being in a mechanical state of sleep and being more conscious. Self-remembering cannot be explained in so many words because it is an experience of greater or lesser intensity. One cannot explain an experience. But there is one fundamental description of what the shock of self-remembering is, to which I will now refer, and which I will compare with the shock of breathing. The shock of breathing consists in a movement out and a movement in, or if you prefer, a movement in and a movement out. There is inspiration and expiration. And the complete act of breathing, or cycle of breathing, includes both. But there is no contradiction in the opposite movements because they form together a complete cycle. We make about 20 such cycles per minute. You will remember that in the table of time in different cosmoses, where it is said that time is breath, man's time of breath is taken as 3 seconds. It is upon the 2 directions in and out that I want you to reflect. How does this correspond with the psychic act of self-remembering? You remember the diagram of the 2 arrows pointing in different ways. This is, so to speak, the diagram of self-remembering. And you see, apparently, a double or contradictory direction. Now let us represent the first shock of breathing by 2 arrows. These directions represent breathing in and breathing out. Now the triangle within the heart of the Enneagram has 3 points numerically termed 3, 6, and 9, and each point represents a place of shock. The shock at 3 is that of breathing. I wonder if any of you have thought that the second shock at 6 is in some way corresponding, namely in some way in and out and in. You will see at once from the diagram of self-remembering that it goes one way and then the other way, in and out and in, just as does breathing. Do you imagine that the first given shock of breathing can have no relation to the second shock and no correspondence? For those who wish to think of this teaching and confirm it in their minds, I would call your attention first of all to this extraordinary triangle standing in the midst of the Enneagram, and then to the nature of the first given shock of air, that is, the inward and the outward movement of breathing. Then I will ask you, do you think that the second shock at point 6, the first consciously given shock, may not have relationship in character to the first mechanically given shock at point 3? The diagram of self-remembering shows that it has. It is these 2 psychic directions or movements connected with self-remembering, as distinct from the 2 physical directions or movements of breathing, that I want you to think about. In self-remembering, a man must look in and look out at the same time. When a person is doing this, you will have no doubt about it, as it gives a certain expression to the eyes. To remember oneself, it is necessary to look in and look out. One must see the outer and see oneself in relation to the outer. But actually, no one can see in and see out at the same time any more than a person can breathe in and breathe out at the same time. A person's attention must go in and then out alternately. And if we compare this with breathing, we can say that an act of self-remembering is an inward and outward movement, not either an inward or an outward movement. An act of self-remembering is a double movement, as is an act of breathing. And so self-remembering can be thought of as consisting in some to and fro motion, psychological in nature, that has to be carried out consciously, that is, with a certain pressure of the attention that is given by aim or by the feeling of the work. For example, I look at the person and then at my reaction in the light of my aim, then outward again at the person, then inward at my reaction, and so on. Identifying then becomes impossible. We will return later to the study of the shock at point 6, but I will add this. Unless you have got to the point of understanding that this work and all esoteric psychology is about your inner states and deals with your reactions to others who act on you, it will all seem vague, fantastic, and unnecessary. Self-observation, the starting point of this work, is to make one realize one's inner states. Evolution is an evolution of inner states. Self-development is a development of inner states. Only you can know your inner states. Only you can separate from useless, negative, or evil states. I repeat that it is impossible to become more conscious, impossible to give the shock at point 6, unless you have begun to be aware of what kinds of things are in you and go on in you. And for this to occur, it is necessary to turn the attention inwards, first of all, and notice your reactions to the outer. But you must also notice the outer. One must find out what external and internal mean, and what this out and in movement means. For to be only in internals or only in externals is wrong. There is you, and there is the external world, transmitted to you by the senses. There is the world, and there are your reactions to it. If you cannot distinguish between yourself and the external world, you cannot apply the first conscious shock. As I said, I will return to this later. At present, notice an external person and notice your reaction to that person and distinguish between them.